In this short video, I'm going to show you through the process to initially deploy a new VMware Cloud Foundation instance and some common scaling exercises. We start with just 4 ESXi hosts, which we'll build as the Cloud Foundation management domain. The Cloud Builder appliance, which we see here, is run from a separate jump host connected on the same host management network as the 4 ESXi hosts. These 4 hosts are built to the same vSphere version as supported with the VCF bill of materials. They've been connected to the same physical network and configured with an IP address, DNS and NTP, and we have all of the documented prerequisites in place, which you'll find on the Broadcom support website. Cloud Foundation 5.x is deployed using either a deployment parameters worksheet, which is an Excel spreadsheet, or a JSON file. Note, we are doing away with the external spreadsheet in a future release of VCF. In this instance here, we're going to use a pre-configured JSON file. Cloud Builder then performs a quick validation to ensure that the inputs are compatible with the ESXi environment. It will check that IPs and DNS are present, licensing, password complexity requirements have been met, vSAN and networking requirements are in place, as well as NTP and a variety of other tasks. This validation process will help to ensure that a deployment is successful. Cloud Builder starts by configuring a single ESXi host, and it is configured to the point where it's ready to host its first virtual machine. From here, it then deploys the management domain vCenter server on its first ESXi host. Once vCenter is running, the remaining 3 hosts are added to the vCenter server to build the first cluster. Once the cluster is completed, the vSphere distributed switch is set up, the VM port groups and the VM kernel interfaces are set up. Once the VM kernel interfaces have been set up, it then goes into configure vSAN. Once vSAN is configured, Cloud Builder will then start to configure our NSX managers. Once our 3 NSX managers are online, Cloud Builder will then configure the transport overlays, the host profiles, and the tunnel endpoints needed for NSX. This will provide everything you need to start configuring software-defined virtual networks. Once NSX is up and running and fully functional, Cloud Builder will then move on to deploy the SDDC Manager appliance, which is unique to Cloud Foundation. SDDC Manager is used to deploy additional workload domains, add clusters, scale clusters, and perform day 2 operations and lifecycle management. SDDC Manager is unique to VCF and is a central point of management for VCF as it stands today. The bringup workflow automates over 150 manual tasks, as you can see here. In a real-world deployment, this will take somewhere between 2.5 to 3 hours to complete. I've sped this process up for the sake of this demo. Moving forward, beyond VCF 5.x, we are moving management away from SDDC Manager, moving it into VCF operations. Note the installation is complete. We can now launch SDDC Manager for the very first time. So here we're logging into SDDC Manager using the credentials that we supplied in the inputs. This is the SDDC Manager dashboard. We can see here that we've configured 1 management domain with a total of 4 hosts. To scale the environment further, we can commission additional hosts, once again using an automated workflow. We once again check that all of our prerequisites are in place before proceeding. We can input the ESXi hosts manually, or we can choose to import them from a JSON file. Here I'm going to import an additional 12 hosts, so we have a total of 16 hosts in the environment. We select to upload the file and perform a quick validation. Once the validation is complete, we can see here that we have an additional 12 hosts. We can then move on to commission these hosts into the VCF inventory. This process just takes a couple of minutes. Once the hosts have been commissioned into the VCF inventory, we can then use these hosts to create a new workload domain or create a new cluster or expand an existing cluster. In this case here, we're going to use 2 of these hosts to expand the management cluster. Once again, we go into the automated workflow and we can choose our hosts. From this view here, we can see the different hosts which are in the VCF inventory, which shows the amount of memory, storage, and number of PNICs configured on each host. So we choose a set of compatible hosts. We then go through and ensure our environmentals are configured for our switches. We can choose to license the environment now, or we can choose to license the environment later. This gives administrators the option of being able to scale an environment where they may not have licenses that are immediately available. The administrator would have 60 days to acquire the license. In this case here, we're going to choose a pre-configured license. We'll hit next and complete the validation. Upon a successful validation, we can then complete the deployment. This process, once again, only takes a few minutes to complete. In addition to scaling additional clusters, we can also choose to configure a new workload domain. A workload domain can be configured in a similar way to the initial bring-up. For new environments running on new hardware, Broadcom recommend using vSAN ESA. For the purpose of this lab, I'm just going to use vSAN OSA. We configure our workload domain with a name, and we can choose to configure our workload domain using a new SSO, or we can join the existing management domain SSO. We configure our cluster name, and we can select our update manager. Broadcom recommend using VLCM images, as VLCM baselines has been deprecated. We select our image. We configure our vCenter server using the fully qualified domain name. We configure the passwords for vCenter server. And we then go in and configure NSX. In this case, we're configuring our NSX manager cluster, and we're also configuring our virtual IP for the cluster. We'll select to configure the NSX manager appliance size as large. We'll configure our administrator passwords, and then click next. For vSAN, in this case, we're configuring our workload domain with 5 ESXi hosts. So we're going to configure this with a failure to tolerate of 1. And we'll enable vSAN deduplication and compression. We'll select our 5 hosts. Click next. We'll configure our switch configuration. In this case, going for the default. We'll add our licenses. We can review the configuration and then hit finish. In around about 45 minutes to an hour, we will have a new workload domain. SDDC Manager automates the full process for you. Once configured, we now have a new workload domain. We can go in and view the network, certificate, configure tagging information, and if we wish to, we can go in and configure additional clusters. So in this case here, we're going to configure vSAN. We'll give our cluster a name. We'll select a cluster image. And we'll go and configure our vSAN storage. In this instance here, you will see an option to configure vSAN HCI or a vSAN compute cluster. As this is the second cluster within this workload domain, we can leverage the underlying vSAN data store that was configured with the first cluster. If we were to choose this option, we would choose to configure a vSAN compute cluster. However, in this example, we're just going to leave this as vSAN HCI. We'll configure our failures to tolerate, and we can enable vSAN deduplication and compression. We'll select our hosts. In this case, we're going to choose all 5. We'll hit next. We'll once again configure our switching. In this case, we're going to use a single VDS and 2 PNICs. We'll go in and configure our licensing for vSAN and vSphere. We'll review and click finish. Once again, within around about 20 to 30 minutes, we should have a new cluster configured for this workload domain. To quickly review what we have completed so far, let's have a look within the vSphere client. You'll see the shortcut menu within the SDDC Manager. Here we can see the management domain and its first cluster. We can also see workload domain 01 and the 2 clusters that we've just configured. This completes our demo for VCF deployment and scale.